Welcome to JR Network Tech. I'm JR, and I'm coming at you with another Cisco how-to video. Before we get started, I just want to remind you to please like this video and hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon as well so that you don't miss a single thing, that you can get every single video that we're putting out for you. Today, we're going to be talking about loopback interfaces and how you can configure one on a Cisco router. Now, when you think about loopback interfaces, they're not like your regular physical interfaces. These interfaces are actually logical, and they can serve a variety of different purposes on the network. Most commonly, they can serve to identify a device. In fact, their IP addresses assigned to these types of interfaces can serve to be the router ID, and that actually gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of different use cases and options when it comes to a variety of different protocols, especially those more complex routing protocols that we use in our network today. To be honest with you, there's a lot of theory involved in loopback interfaces and their uses, and we just want to know, how do we configure one? So let's figure that out. Let's get into the equipment here and see how we can actually configure a loopback interface. Now, we are into our two router topology that we've been using here. And what we're going to do first, we're in router 1, R1, and we're going to go ahead and do a show IP interfaces brief. And we're going to see what interfaces we have here running. Now, I want to make something very clear. I want you to remember this. We ran this command and it's showing us the physical interfaces that we have here. Because a loopback interface is not a physical interface, in fact, it's not even configured yet, it's not going to show up here in this list if we run this command. And we're also not going to be able to do a show run interface loopback 0. It's going to tell us it's invalid. It's an invalid input. Why is that? Because we have to actually create the interface. It's not going to show up in our running configuration. It's not going to show up in our show IP interfaces brief command because it doesn't exist, at least not yet. So I want you to remember that in order for us to actually see the status and see the configuration of a loopback interface, we actually have to create the interface and configure it. So that's what we're going to do. Another thing I want you to remember as well is that because the loopback interfaces are logical, we can kind of have as many of them as we want. If we're going to go with our best practice here and configure them in order and start with the first one, I want you to remember that we're using computer language here. And in computer language, we don't start with the number 1, we start with the number 0, which is why when we put in the show run interface loopback 0, we did a loopback 0 because that's the first one that we would use is 0. So just remember that in computer talk, we start with 0, not 1. But I'm sure you already knew that. But let's go ahead and configure a loopback interface. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into configuration mode here. And to create the loopback interface, we are simply going to type the command interface loopback 0. Remember, because it's our first one. So we're going to do interface loopback 0, and we're into that interface. We've created it, and look at that. As soon as we created this interface, this logical interface, it came up. So isn't that interesting? So now that we're in this interface that we created, we can go ahead and assign an IP address. And because we are in R1, our first router, we're going to give it a unique IP address so it can serve as the router ID for a variety of different protocols, especially those complex routing protocols. So let's go ahead and assign an IP address of 1.1.1.1. And we're going to keep things simple for ourselves. We're going to give it a /24 subnet mask. We can do that. And we're going to hit enter, and we're going to hit end. And let's go ahead and verify again. Let's up arrow to our show IP interface brief. And notice we now have listed our loopback interface, our loopback 0 interface, with our assigned IP address of 1.1.1.1, or as we'll say for short, our quad 1's IP address. So we can now see that because we created the interface itself, and it's now up. And we can also up arrow to our show run interface loopback 0, and look at that. We can now see a running configuration for the loopback 0 interface that we just created. We can see the IP address that we gave it as well, in addition to the subnet mask. So that was quite easy, wasn't it? In fact, it was so easy that what we're going to do is we're going to get on over into R2 and do the same exact thing. So before we get started, we're going to do a show IP interfaces brief just to verify. Notice the loopback interface is not there because we haven't created it yet. So let's go ahead and create it. We're going to go into configuration mode. We're going to type in the command interface loopback 0, and you can use a shortened form of that so you don't have to type out the word loopback. LO 0. Let's type it out. It's going to come up for us. Look at it. There it is. We're going to put in our IP address. Because this is R2, we're going to put in the IP address 2.2.2.2, and we're going to give it a /24 subnet mask. And we're going to go ahead and come out of this configuration. We're going to go back into privilege mode. We're going to up arrow to do our verification command. And look at that. It's now showing up in our list as loopback 0 with the IP address of quad 2's, 2.2.2.2. The status, it's up and up. And we are also going to do a show run interface loopback 0. And we can now see it in our running configuration. So I think that's it. We are done. We're done configuring the loopback interface for both of these routers. And I got to tell you something. It kind of seemed a little too easy, but we did it. So now we know. Now we know how to configure a loopback interface on a Cisco router. We did it for R1 and R2. I want you to remember that until you actually create the interface and configure it, you're not going to see it in your verification command. So just remember that. And remember as well that if you're going to start with the first loopback, remember to start with 0, not 1. Because in computer language, we always start with 0. And it really is as easy as that. Once you have your loopback interfaces created and configured, you can kind of do a lot of the same things with them that you would normally do with a physical interface. And again, a serve to be an identifier for the device. It can be a router ID, and that really helps us out a lot when it comes to some of the more complex tasks that a network engineer will perform, especially when it comes to working with routing protocols, particularly the complex ones, such as OSPF and even the monster of BGP. It's not so much of a monster, and hopefully in the future we'll be taking a closer look into that together. But for now, this video is over. So I want to thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss a single thing. And please share this video with your friends and colleagues. I'm JR. This is JR Network Tech. Once again, please, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.